everyone can hear us. There's 37 already, run rising. We just broke the 50 mark. How many of these have you done? Have you done many of these?
Yeah, I've done a few, and it's all right. It sort of works. It's a bit weird not seeing the people you're talking to.
Yeah.
And talking into the void and not being completely sure that your web connection's still working and all the rest of it, but you just sort of keep going and hope for the best.
Well, look, I tell you what, we've got. I mean, I'm going to give it another minute, and then we're going to kick off. This would be a pretty crowded room in Oxford. First of all, thank you very much for joining us. Everyone knows you, the campaigner, the environmentalist, the author. I have to say, at 57, if anything, you're intensifying your enthusiasm and your engagement with something that I know has gripped you all your life. You're going to talk about feeding the planet without. Can we feed the world without devouring the planet? You've got the floor. I'm signing off. I'm putting myself on mute. And over to you.
Well, thanks, Will, and thanks everyone for joining us. I'm sorry we can't all be there in person. We'll meet again one day, I hope, if we ever get out of this nightmare. But what it does show us is the extraordinary vulnerability that all societies face to external shock. We tend to live in a bubble of false comfort. We have the sense that someone's looking after us. Government's looking after us, this thing we call the market, which is really the euphemism we use for the power of money, that's looking after us. Things will shake out okay because that's what they do, isn't it? And then suddenly something comes along which says, actually, maybe things don't always shake out okay. And unless you've got a government which is looking to the future, planning for the future, and then acting upon those plans, and sometimes overriding this thing called the market and stepping in and saying, sorry, but this is what we're going to have to do, then actually things could shake out very badly indeed. And we've witnessed at the early stages of this pandemic, the very ugly spectacle of people fighting over toilet paper. And we've witnessed an awful lot of worse things since then. But I would like to suggest that by comparison to what I want to talk about this evening, it, horrific as it is really a very small crisis, because the thing I'm here to talk about is, as far as human beings are concerned, possibly the biggest crisis of all, which is the issue of whether or not we can feed ourselves. And if you think the spectacle of people fighting over toilet paper is ugly, we don't want to see people fighting over food. That would be very, very ugly indeed. So the baseline situation, as I see it, is this, that depending on whose estimates you believe, by 2050, we could need another 50%, another 70% more food on current trajectories to feed everyone who will be alive then. Partly as a result of population growth, but actually that's the lesser of the two major factors. The other factor is itself a different form of population growth, the growth in livestock, the livestock population, which already massively outweighs the human population. It's growing at roughly twice the rate of the human population, about 2.1% human population growth rate, 1.05%. By 2050, at current rates of expansion, there'll be, to put it in brutal terms, 120 million tons of extra human being and 400 million tons of extra livestock on Earth. And the reason for this is, with economic growth, the switch towards meat eating and other animal products. And of course, all those livestock need to be fed, and that feed has to come from somewhere. And so a lot of the land which is currently feeding human beings could, if the market is allowed to hold sway, instead be diverted to feeding animals, which are then in turn fed to more prosperous people, taking food out of the mouths of the poor. Of course, it doesn't have to go in that direction, but that's the drift, the market drift, in which it's going at the moment. So we're talking about massively more pressure on food supplies, which means a lot more pressure on land, a lot more pressure on all the agricultural inputs which are required to produce that food, whether it's extra pesticides, extra nitrates and other fertilizers, extra water being a key one, and of course, extra soil. Well, where's that going to come from? So we look at this situation and say, well, yeah, that looks pretty grim. Perhaps we ought to do something to change that trajectory, because otherwise we're not going to have any rainforests left. We're not going to have any wetlands left. We're not going to have anywhere which is potentially farmable, which isn't being farmed, because we're going to see a vast expansion in the farm area. We're not going to have any irrigation water left. And frankly, the way most places are being farmed, we're not going to have much soil left either. And soil is, of course, the basis of all civilization. We don't think about it very much. It is literally beneath us. We disregard this crucial resource at our peril. So that all sounds pretty grim, and but it sounds like the sort of thing in which you could intervene if you were a proactive dirigiste government. We don't have too many of those around at the moment, but that would be a potentially fixable problem. But that is not the only aspect of the problem that we face, because at the same time, we are now committed to at least 2 degrees of global heating. In fact, if all governments met their commitments under the Paris Agreement, their nationally determined contributions under the Paris Climate Agreement, we would probably end up with somewhere between 3 and 4 degrees centigrade of global heating, which basically is full-on climate breakdown. Again, we must hope that that is not the trajectory which follows through, but even 2 degrees could be exceedingly dangerous, not only to many of our crucial ecosystems and earth systems, but also to our food supply. There's been a number of papers published recently showing some pretty dire predictions for some of our major bread baskets at between 2 and 3.5 degrees of heating. This isn't a precise science because it's about the future. You can't say with exactness at what point suddenly bread baskets start to collapse, can no longer support the cereal crops which they produce at the moment. But at some point in that range, it's likely to happen. And it's likely to happen for the following major reasons: that it simply becomes too hot for certain crops to survive, that they have their thermal tolerances, their thermal limits, and beyond a certain point, they can't form grain. Soil moisture in many places declines significantly. Rainfall patterns massively change. A lot of land becomes inundated, or salt gets sucked up into aquifers as the aquifers are depleted and the sea level simultaneously rises. We also see that in many parts of the world, which are particularly dominated by smallholder farming, which can, under the right circumstances, be very productive, that involves people working outdoors. And we now see maps of future heat distribution, which suggests that that will simply become impossible in many parts of the world above about 2 degrees centigrade of global heating. So just as we need to expand food production, and I think we'll need to expand it even if the livestock trajectory is not followed, we see really extremely dangerous potential pressures put on even our existing food supply. Number one is global heating, climate breakdown, and if we do see the collapse of some of the major food growing regions and basically their transition into dust bowls, it's very hard to see how that food is going to be grown elsewhere, because there aren't many grain exporters left in the world now. Basically, you take North America out of the picture and we're in food deficit, and huge parts of North America, but also many other crucial grain growing regions are threatened by climate breakdown. At the same time, to support even existing levels of agriculture, we'll have to keep pumping irrigation water out of aquifers at way beyond sustainable rates. And already A lot of aquifers are pretty close to the tipping point where they just won't be able to support even existing rates of irrigation or anywhere near them because of overuse, depletion of that groundwater being sucked out much faster than it's being replaced. Similarly with soils, we are losing, by some estimates, around 12 million hectares of land a year through soil degradation. That's what brings empires down. You know, civilizations can survive war, they can survive temporary famines, they can survive plagues, you'd be glad to hear. But soil destruction, they don't survive that. That's why they go down. That's one of the primary reasons why civilizations have collapsed again and again, because without the soil, you have no means of subsistence. So you put all those factors together, rising demand for food, plus potentially massively reducing capacity for growing food, and we see we could be in very big trouble indeed. So for the past year or so, I've been researching what the hell we can do to get out of this potential catastrophe. And you know, I don't know how likely it is that all these things come together, but I wouldn't want to bet against it. And I certainly wouldn't want to be complacent in the face of what could be an existential catastrophe for the great majority of people on Earth. And we all know what will happen, that if there's very limited food supply, the rich will mop it up, rich nations will mop it up, rich people within those nations will mop it up. And as things stand, the rest of the world will be just left to go hang, which is almost unimaginable what that could look like. You know, none of us have experienced, and no one alive today has experienced global food deficit, systemic global harvest failure. It has not happened in the lifetime of anyone alive today. National failures, regional failures, yes, but not global failure. And it's almost unimaginable. So what can we do? And as I say, it's a work in progress. I've still got a couple more years of research to do on this because it is such a huge and complex topic. But so far, my thinking is this, that we, to the greatest extent possible, take protein production out of agriculture and put it in a completely different place altogether. And what I'm thinking of in particular is the production of microbial protein, protein made probably most efficiently from soil bacteria in vats, grown in the same way that we produce yeast for brewing or for baking, and indeed lots of other products like citric acid made from microorganisms, or insulin. There's a whole load of stuff that we do which is very similar to what I got in mind. And it's already beginning to happen. There's a place called Solar Foods in Helsinki that I visited last year, and I was the first person outside the lab to eat a pancake made from microbial protein. And the shocking, astounding fact is that it tasted just like a pancake. But of course, the idea is not to make pancakes from it. Well, you can make, or evidently can make pancakes from it, and I'm still alive. It was one of the less dangerous things I've done in my life. But this could be the feedstock for a whole load of different kinds of foods, for cultured meat, cultured fish, cultured milk, cultured eggs. It could be the protein filler for a whole lot of food where we're currently getting protein from soya or from all sorts of other sources, which can be very destructive. This could step in. In terms of land use, it's extremely efficient. You are talking about 20,000 times less land as your factory footprint than you would need if you were growing that protein in fields, or even less land than you would need if you were growing that protein through animals. But it does require a lot of energy. It requires a lot of electricity for electrolysis to produce the hydrogen on which these bacteria feed, and for all the plant process within the factory. But you know, that electricity could come at a fairly low environmental cost. We've seen the massive expansion, of course, of renewables. They're much, much cheaper than they were. I'm very interested in thorium reactors and other 4th generation modular nuclear reactors, which can achieve temperatures hot enough to split hydrogen from water without the need for electrolysis, which can make the whole process much more efficient still. I mean, it's very interesting this, because if this does take off, and I really hope it does, because I'm not sure what other options we've got, it would be the first time that a major staple foodstuff was eaten by human beings, which was not the product of photosynthesis. Photosynthesis has nothing to do with it. There's a hydrogen oxygenating bacteria. They completely bypass that process. The process of hydrogen oxygenation is actually far more efficient than photosynthesis. Obviously, in terms of inputs, which both land use, water, nutrients, it requires a lot less than when we're producing our food from plants, not least because the bacteria are Monge too. You make a flour, you just dry the bacteria, and the whole thing turns into flour, which in this case we just mixed with a bit of oat milk, and bang, we just made pancakes just like that, straight out of bacterial flour plus oat milk. In fact, we could have just used water. There's 60% protein, and straight away you've just got an edible feedstock, whereas with the plant you could eat at most about 10% of that plant. So potentially there's something which can be worked on here. There's a lot of issues with it, not least corporate IP, intellectual property rights. I think all this stuff should be open source. I think it's desperately required that we have new open source food technologies which are not captured and stitched up by corporations, not least because open source often tends to be far more efficient in developing new technology than corporate IP, where corporations often, they can sit on something, they have a limited pool of people who are working on it, put something out to open source, and as we've seen with some of the hackathons recently, developing new ventilators, new forms of PPE, new design can come along very quickly indeed and overcome some of the technological barriers. So potentially, and there's quite a lot of ifs here, we could take protein production out of agriculture. It would mean no more need for livestock. It would be no more need for soya and other sources of protein. And we could substitute not just existing food, but we could also produce potentially a whole lot of novel foodstuffs. I would love to see some innovative chefs start to work with microbial protein, or for that matter, fungal protein. I mean, there's lots of different ways of doing this. But the great thing about microbial protein is you don't need a feedstock which comes from plants. You don't need to grow crops in order to feed the protein. They live on hydrogen, carbon dioxide, and water. I mean, that's it. So it makes you basically bypass the whole agricultural system and the whole photosynthetic pathway. So then you have a residue, you have some carbohydrate being produced and some lipid indeed being produced by this process, about 60% protein. The rest is roughly split between carbohydrates and lipids, nucleic acids. The lipids, with a few tweaks, could start producing lauric acid. Goodbye palm oil, wouldn't that be a nice thing? They could also, you could start producing omega-3s. Goodbye commercial fishing, another nice thing. Goodbye fish farming too, another great environmental boon to get rid of those. And then you've got some carbohydrate which could start to substitute potentially some of the flours, the carbohydrate flours that we use. But that's not enough. I mean, we will still need to produce carbohydrate by other means. It's quite difficult to see how it will be commercially worthwhile to do that in factories, because basically carbohydrate flour is, and we must hope remains, a very cheap foodstuff. So if we've taken out enough land, probably about 60% or more of, well, if you include grazing land, you're talking about over 80% of farmland is removed. If you're no longer using farming to produce protein, then maybe what farmland remains useful and productive, we focus on carbohydrate production and maybe some oil crops as well, and on horticulture. And let's concentrate horticulture in places where it can be sustained. And let's look at all sorts of new techniques for doing so. I mean, with continued cultivation, I think we need to switch away from ploughing as quickly as possible and move towards no-till farming, where you leave all the crop residues on the surface. You don't turn over the soil, you drill directly into it and put the seeds in that way. And that is becoming very popular and successful in many parts of the world. It's come to Britain quite late, but it's big in the US, big in South America, because it is much better for conserving the soil. And it tends to be far more resilient to climate shocks. Just before the lockdown, I visited a farm in Shropshire just after those 3 massive storms we had. And it was quite amazing. I got picked up by the farmer from Shrewsbury Station, and as we drove towards his farm, it looks as if a tank battle had been fought in all the fields we drove past. It was just churned up as people had been trying to plough and harrow and sow in fields which had basically just been ripped apart by these massive storms. It was a total disaster. The soil was running off into the road. There were ruts 3 foot deep in these fields, exposing the gravel in some places. The soil was all separating out into sand and silt. The entire structure collapsed. We get to this farm, the one I was visiting, where he was doing no-till farming, and the soil was totally stable. It still had this sort of bouncy, springy feel to it. There'd been no loss at all from it, and simply because he was using this technique which does not require ploughing. So that has got to be part of it. We need to be looking at drought-resistant crops. Now, I'm very much opposed to the kind of genetic engineering that Monsanto was doing, where they were just using it basically to acquire patents and to develop Terminator seeds so that farmers couldn't keep their own. But I believe we do need genetic engineering or other advanced crop breeding to produce drought-tolerant crops, to buy ourselves as much time as we possibly can, and indeed, for that matter, heat-tolerant crops. And there's some quite promising developments now, which could ensure that we have at least a decade or 2 longer in some parts of the world than we would otherwise have. Where horticulture is concerned, I'm very interested indeed in what some people call veganics or stock-free growing, which basically means using absolute minimum inputs to the land. There's a farmer whose work I've been following, Ian Tolhurst, who's just 20 miles from Oxford, who is an organic farmer, but he doesn't use farmyard manure. He doesn't use any inputs at all, except for an average of 1 millimeter of wood chip per year. He uses deep-rooted weeds to pull up nutrients from the subsoil. He's got an extremely nutrient conservative cultivation technique, which basically keeps all the nutrients on the land. And he basically uses that little bit of wood chip as an inoculant to encourage mycorrhizal relationships, the relationships between fungi and plants. And the fungi, if you've got a lot of fungi in their symbiotic relationships with plants, they use nutrients in the soil far more efficiently than they otherwise do. And though he's an organic farmer, and organic farming usually has significantly lower yields than conventional farming, he's now bumping up against the bottom of the curve of conventional farming through these extremely successful techniques with almost minimal inputs. So I'm quite excited by stuff like that. There's a lot of other quite interesting stuff going on in horticulture. I think at the moment, although as I say, it's quite early days in my research, I think if we put all that stuff together, and if we have governments which start working on it right away with massive R&D, huge public spending on this, so treating it with the seriousness that it deserves to be treated with, if we have open source technologies being developed by as many people as possible, as many brilliant minds on this as possible, not mopped up by a few corporations, and if we use all the technological and organizational skills at our disposal, we might get through this. If we don't, I suspect we won't. And I suspect we are running into a crisis which will make this horrendous pandemic look like a picnic. So on that cheery note, I'll turn it over to questions. Thank you.
George, my God, that's both a scary picture you paint, but also, you know, grounds for optimism. Now, for our participants, I'm going to put a couple of questions to George. I mean, there's virtually 100 of you. If you like to pose a question in the queue, if you just drag your mouse down to the bottom of the screen, the toolbar should appear, and on the right it says Q&A. If you can write your questions there. If you can't manage that, go to the chat function, and you can make a comment in there, and I will be monitoring both the Q&A and the chat function for any questions that come through. I mean, I suppose as you were talking, I mean, I was thinking two or three things. I mean, you presumably come across these kind of these vertical farms where with intensive light, you know, they're 20 or 30 stories high, and essentially you grow, well, I mean, you grow kind of high value added plants. Have you come across all this? And I mean, there's a old British steelworks in Scunthorpe which has been converted to this. I just wondered if you know what your view on that was.
Yeah, well, I don't want to diss vertical farms. They're really great for growing skunk. The economics stack up very nicely.
Thank you for that.
I mean, basically, you're talking about a huge investment to produce something which is pretty low value, unless it's skunk, where it does make sense, but you might have some issues with the authorities over that. But you know, the only thing you might possibly get away with the enormous amount of upfront money you're putting down is very high-end boutique vegetables that delivered directly to posh restaurants. This vertical farming is, in my view, irresponsibly being promoted as a way of feeding the world. It just doesn't work. I mean, apart from anything else, you know, there's the cost, number one. There's the energy inputs, which can be extremely high. If you're having to provide lighting for all these plants, you know, you're substituting the outdoor light for indoor light, which you've got to produce from electricity. The embodied energy in all the steel framing and everything, the motors, the whole lot. I mean, it really, you know, if you think you're going to grow staple crops that way, you know, yeah, okay, fine, if bread were £100 a loaf, but we're going to really have to hope that bread isn't going to be £100 a loaf. So we're seeing already a lot of these vertical farming ventures going bust, principally because they didn't listen to Uncle George. I predicted this a few years ago. I can't claim to be an investment guru, but I just said, look, it doesn't add up. The figures simply do not add up. So yeah, unless you are growing interesting narcotics, don't bother.
There's a technical question here. How does ploughing reduce the soil quality as opposed to no-till farming? What's the, I mean, I was interested in that too.
Sure. So there's several ways. I mean, one, it physically breaks down the structure. I mean, soil, it's a bit like a coral reef. You've got structured areas and less structured areas. And you have the rhizosphere, which is the area around the roots. And you have the drylosphere, which is the area around worm burrows, some of which are intergenerational. You know, you'll have the baby worms moving into the burrows of their parents for years and years. And around those zones, the rhizosphere and the drylosphere, you've got all these subzones occupied by different microbes, by protists eating the microbes, by nematodes eating the protists, these incredibly complex relationships, the springtails, the mites, the worms, the fungi, and it's those relationships which both stabilize the soil, hold it all together, you know, literally in the form of the roots and stuff. They stabilize the soil, but they also cycle the nutrients through it. They keep it fertile. They make those nutrients available to plants. If you smash through those coral reefs, as unfortunately some trawlers exactly do that at sea, and destroy that ecosystem, it becomes considerably less productive. it also becomes, the soil, the substrate becomes much more labile, much softer, and so it can be stripped away more easily by rain or by wind. This is what we saw with the Dust Bowl in the 1930s. Exactly that happened in the Midwest in North America. And in fact, it was very interesting. This farm I visited in Shropshire, they had done a test ploughing strip to compare and contrast. And the ploughing strip, the soil, it felt lovely. It was like blancmange. You sort of sunk into it and it was all soft. You pick it up in your hands and say, oh, this soil feels lovely. So yeah, it feels like that because it's completely lost its structure. And the fact that you sink into it when you tread on it shows how fragile that's now become and how easily it can be stripped off the land. Basically, soil should be springy and firm,
yeah.
And then it's much more resilient to shock.
Look, there's a number of questions. The questions are pouring in. There's one, a consistent one, which is, what you're describing is fairly radical. I mean, fairly, drop that, radical. And there's one here, how could these new microbial proteins combat certain societies' profound social and cultural attachment to traditional meat? There's others where, you're asking corporations to, there's a substantive amount, corporations will both see opportunity in this and both see resistance. I mean, just talk a bit about that. I mean, you've got to convince governments, you've got to convince corporations. And is there a possibility, asks one questioner, that actually some of the rules against genetically modified agriculture that the EU have may allow some of your stuff to go forward after Brexit in a way it might not have been in the EU? One of the few positive things about leaving the EU. Yeah,
okay, thanks. All really interesting questions. To what extent are we resistant? To what extent do we stick with the old ways of eating? Well, it has to be said that our diets have changed massively in the last few years, not generally in a good way. We moved towards what B. Wilson calls the global standard diet, which is basically burgers and chips and crisps and soda and stuff which is basically not very good for us at all, away from all our traditional cuisines, and often at great cost to our health and often indeed at environmental cost as well. But the positive we can take from that is that actually people are highly prepared to change their diets, very quickly indeed, often in response to marketing, advertising campaigns by corporations, driving us very often in the wrong direction. But it shows that we're not fixed, we're not locked into particular dietary patterns, much less so than we think. I mean, it's very interesting. You hear this thing going around a lot, saying, don't eat anything your great-grandmother wouldn't recognize as food. It's a quote from Michael Pollan, and I see it coming up again and again and again. And I look at my diet and think, my great-grandmother wouldn't recognize any of this stuff as food. And she didn't even recognize garlic as food. That was something which continentals ate, and they were weird for eating garlic. It's like she didn't even recognize spaghetti as food. There's almost nothing that I eat that she recognizes as food. And I would say I've got a much better diet than she had. This, I think, one of the biggest threats we face.
Just stop for a second. Give us a sense of just give us 20 seconds, not to stop your flow, but just on your diet. What do you eat?
Sure. So it's basically a plant-based diet. And I'll start the day with a kind of muesli porridgey thing that I make myself, based on, I work for The Guardian, so obviously this is in the contract. It's basically rice flakes and hemp flakes, because oats give me indigestion, with pumpkin seeds and hazelnuts and my homemade plum jam and oat milk. Of those, my grandmother would recognize homemade jam. She might recognize hazelnuts out of their shells. Yes, she probably would. None of the rest of it she would recognize as food. For lunch, I might have some bread. She would recognize that, though her bread would, if you fed it to the ducks would sink. So I think it's quite similar bread to what my grandma used to make. My homemade hummus made from chickpeas, garlic, lemon juice and olive oil. She would recognize lemon juice, but the lemon juice she recognized would have come out of a squeezy plastic thing, not out of a lemon. And then for dinner, I might make some Thai squash thing with noodles and basil and tofu. She wouldn't recognize any of that as food. This is, you know, as far as she's concerned, completely alien. So, and yet, you know, this is a good diet and actually a very low impact diet, which is why I follow it. So, you know, we mustn't get hooked up on bucolic nostalgia. You know, that I think is one of the biggest threats we face. And food writing is a disaster in this area. You know, it's all about, oh, we should all be eating pasture-fed meat. Pasture-fed meat is a total environmental catastrophe. People say the problem is intensive meat production. Sure, the problem is intensive meat production. Extensive meat production is even worse because by definition, you need more land to produce the same amount of meat. Pasture-fed meat is an extreme luxury product. And the only reason that anyone can eat it is that everyone doesn't eat it. If everyone did eat it, we would cook the planet in moments. There just wouldn't be any space for producing that. And so, you know, we've got to get off this sort of, I think, toxic combination of sort of gourmet and poetic nostalgia for this sort of pastoral Arcadian scene. That is a recipe for total disaster. Apart from that, no complaints.
What about some of the points that people are making about, you know, the possibilities? I mean, it was quite interesting hearing you talk about genetically modified food and genetic modifications to produce more kind of drought-resistant plants. And has that possibility opened up, do you think? I mean, the EU does take, I mean, you know, you talk to me, the passionate Remainer, but the EU does take a tough line on that.
Yeah, and there were good reasons. I mean, I was part of the very first anti-GM protest in Britain, which was actually outside the virology labs in Oxford. And they were proposing, I mean, outrageously, to release this genetically modified disease organism, pathogen, into open polytunnels just outside Whiteham Woods to spray onto caterpillars on their cabbages without any proper controls, any proper containment. And when we said, but what's going to stop this from spreading into Whiteham Woods and the surrounding places and into the environment in general and wiping out all sorts of other caterpillars, they said, well, it's specific to this caterpillar. And you say, well, how do you know? Well, this is the one we tested it on. It turns out they haven't tested it on any others. And we managed to stop that. It was an absolutely outrageous bulldozing of public protections, of any sensible precaution in research and development. And we stopped that, and we were right to do so. And we were right, I believe, to campaign against Monsanto and its Terminator seeds and its Roundup Ready livestock fodder crops. So there was no good coming to people or to the living world from that stuff. But that doesn't mean that all genetically modified crops are wrong. And I think there is potential for using GM as one of many breeding techniques to produce crops which are going to be resilient to some of the potential shocks that we face. And drought tolerant and heat tolerant crops, also rice which can survive inundation for longer, these sorts of things could be crucial tools as we approach climate disaster. Look, you know, these are desperate times, and if we start laying down all these rules of what can and can't be done, then we limit our options.
There's lots of people asking you about their variants. I mean, their variants, but essentially either doubting that governments will commit to the R&D that's required, or asking you what will shock them into doing it, or if you've seen good examples of the kind of R&D that you're calling for.
Mm-hmm. Well, obviously that's a really good and important question, or set of questions. We do tend to have this sort of slightly passive view of politics. So, I wonder what will happen. You know, I hear this a lot with the coronavirus crisis. Will we come out of this into a better world or into a worse world? Will governments tackle the car? Will they tackle airlines, tackle climate breakdown? You know, will there be a transition to a Green New Deal when we come out? And we sort of sit there and watch as if politics is a spectator sport. It is not a spectator sport. Good things happen only if people push for those things to happen, using all the democratic tools in the box. If you just wait to see what might happen, bad things happen, because corporate lobbyists and billionaires who have already got the ear of government and are probably funding the government governing parties and own the newspapers, they will get their foot in the door and have their needs met, which are very often diagonally opposite to the needs of society as a whole. In fact, there's a very interesting thesis by the Canadian sociologist Kevin Mackay saying that what civilizations that have collapsed all have in common, and the only thing they really have in common, is controlled by oligarchies. And that when you have oligarchic control, you make that civilization extremely unstable and subject to collapse, because oligarchic control tends to be very short-termist. It tends to have the interests only of a tiny proportion of the people in mind, while disregarding the interests of the great majority, and it drives societies towards disaster. Now, when we say the word oligarch these days, people think of Russians. No, Rupert Murdoch is an oligarch. Billionaires are oligarchs. The people who control the major corporations are oligarchs. It doesn't matter what their nationality is. And we are in serious danger, particularly in the UK and the US, Brazil, several other countries are moving towards oligarchic control. And already we're seeing with the coronavirus what that does. It's not good. So what do? Well, we mobilize for the changes that we want to see. But obviously we can't do that until we know what those changes are. And so I see my work for the next couple of years on this as trying to work out what we need to do, what needs to happen, and then to start to build the political movements which demand that governments act on this. It's not going to happen by itself. You're muted again, Will.
Sorry, are there good examples of the R&D that, you know, you would like to see? I mean, is there any, you know, I mean, you mentioned a few. I mean, I think I know the farm that you're referring to in Oxford. I think it's just north of Burford. Been there myself.
That's a different one, actually. But I know that I think you're thinking of Ian Wilkinson's farm.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah,
which is also very interesting. Farm Ed, they're doing some interesting stuff there. I visited them in the spring.
Yeah, I think we went there for the same reasons, really. But look, I mean, I'm, you know, is there a corporation? Is there a government which actually, you know, you can say, you know, we want more of that, or that's an exemplar of the kind of thing that you're calling for, on which we can build?
Very little at the moment. I mean, actually, interestingly, the governments which tend to be leading on this are governments of the poor world, not of the rich world. You know, so you would look to places like Costa Rica or Kenya for interesting innovation driven partly by government. Otherwise, it's just been left to the private sector. And, you know, the interests of the private sector are not the interests of humanity as a whole. They want to turn a profit, fair enough. That's what they're in it for. But that is not necessarily the right route for the very long-term and risky development of something completely new. You know, they tend to avoid that sort of investment, as you know, Will, very well. You know, so much of your work has demonstrated. And so we do need government involvement, massive R&D, massive thinking about this. We're not getting it at the moment. We're going to have to press for that. Okay.
I mean, what about a number of people have said, and are you attacking this in the wrong way? You know, you're thinking of more effective ways of producing food that conserves water and soil. What about having fewer people to feed global population? I mean, can we support this population? And secondly, what about the redistribution of food within the current population? Someone's just pointed out that we've got 2 billion overweight adults. Why not try and tackle the distribution of food by them having a little bit less? What do you think of all of that?
Incidentally, I can hear the ringnet parakeets in the background. I'm pretty well placed where you are as a result.
Well, I thought I had to honour you by being in a place where, yeah, they're nice, aren't they? I thought you'd like them.
Anyway, so sorry about the diversion. So, so population first. population is probably going to peak at 10 or maybe 11 billion people roughly at the end of this century. Then it will start to decline. Even if we were to bring every single possible intervention into that, so a lot of which are highly problematic, because basically us rich people saying, you poor people stop breeding, and there's a really dark history to all that, really nasty places where we've got to be very, very careful stepping into. There's very weak leverage. If every woman on earth had full reproductive control, and that is definitely an aim we should all be pressing for, total control over their own bodies, which is absolutely essential for a whole host of reasons. And so therefore overcoming all the barriers, the religious barriers, the cultural barriers, the political barriers, the economic barriers, the barriers to actually the actual physical delivery of contraception, overcoming all those barriers, the surplus population, as it's called, in other words, the extra people every year, would decline by about a quarter. And the reason for that is that we have this thing called demographic momentum. Basically, most of the population growth that will happen in future is already baked in, even if populations, even if they have no more children than replacement rate, simply because of the exponential function being as it is. I mean, it's not exponential, not exponential growth as is commonly understood, in that the growth is declining very rapidly from a peak of 2.2% in 1963 to 1.05% today. It is exponential in that the growth is a function of the prior numbers. And so you've got a demographic momentum, which means that there's very little you can actually do about it short of mass murder. But even mass murder in the past actually has very little impact on global population. And I hope that no one is proposing that. Only the Black Death really had a major impact where disease is concerned on global population size. Basically, I see population as a situation which we must work with, rather than as something which can in any reasonable or desirable way be changed. And
just to be clear, you think the world can live with 10 billion people?
I think we're going to have to live with 10 billion people. On the other question, though, sorry, the question of obesity and overeating and the rest of it. Yeah, look, no one wants to be obese. No one wants to overeat. It's considered highly undesirable. But this is an addiction. This is a physiological and psychological problem which people have, and has been encouraged massively by the junk food industry, which engineers foods so that they are as addictive as possible with the combination of fat, sugar, and salt. In the right ratio, you can make it, you really stimulate people's cravings. And so again, there's a real danger of sort of putting this on individuals, saying, well, it's your fault because you're eating too much, you're taking food away from other people. The far more appropriate thing is to say to rich people, eat less meat. Because actually that really is taking food away from people, and you can eat less meat while still eating, really good food. That's a dietary choice which is much easier to make than eat less junk food. I mean, if you're addicted to junk food, it's very, very hard to get off that. Now, obviously, we should encourage and support people to do so for their own benefit, for the benefit of their own health. But, as with the population thing, there's a real danger of saying it's those people eating too much. They're the greedy ones, they're having too many babies, they're eating too much. This is a shared global problem, which requires shared global solutions. And if we try to individuate it, which is a sort of classic disease of our time, it's a classic aspect of neoliberalism, where you say you deny the existence of structural problems. And you say it's because of people being overindulgent, of people being lazy, people being feckless, people having too many children, people eating too much. You don't then address the real roots of the problem. And the roots of the problem is, one, the switch towards eating animals and animal products, which is incredibly costly, but it's driven very often by government subsidies and government policy. And two, the massive global environmental constraints which we're now facing.
Now, two
Just
questions.
to finish that off, to round that off, sorry. At the moment, we produce enough food for 10 billion people. A lot of it is wasted, a lot of it is diverted, but we could quite easily feed 10 billion people today if need be. But that food supply is going to start coming under major strain pretty soon.
Now, there's two questions here which are quite interesting, back to back, both of which take you slightly different directions, but are important. One, what happens in your scenario if you have a kind of monocultural bacteria, what a potential disaster if there's little genetic variation in the bacteria strain? That's one question challenging you on your science. Another one saying, there's a trend in the global north towards community farms, allotments, movement away from monoculture lawns. Is that a viable solution as opposed to your technological fix?
Thanks, both very good and important questions. So on the first one, basically we're talking about contained systems and hopefully distributed systems. You know, I don't want to be one vast factory supplying the whole world. Let's have lots of factories, lots of different microbial strains. I mean, there's no end to the variations that you can introduce. Batches can become contaminated. You know, we see this in all sorts of processes, but basically, you know, brewing, fermentation, which is broadly what we're talking about, is now down to a pretty fine art, which is why beer tastes so depressingly consistent these days, and bread is so depressingly consistent these days, because they know how to do it. And they know how to exclude contaminants. And even if one vat becomes contaminated, well, you know, hopefully you're going to have thousands of vats in hundreds of countries, all producing food elsewhere, and they don't become contaminated by what's in that vat. In fact, it's far less susceptible to invasion by pests than agriculture is. And we currently see these massive locust swarms storming across the Middle East and East Africa, and indeed Southern Africa now, wiping out vast amounts of crops with devastating impacts on local people. That crops are far more susceptible than the technologies I'm talking about. Now, as for going small scale, yes, I'm very much in favour of that. I think that, I mean, there's plenty of evidence showing that small scale farming, all other things being equal, is more productive than large scale farming on a per hectare basis, not on a labour basis. Lower labour productivity, but higher land productivity, because people grow more intensively, a wider range of crops, subcropping, companion planting, all sorts of things going on at the same time on a small piece of land, which a large farmer with a huge tractor can't do. And far more intense control of soil structure, soil nutrients, and all the rest of it. There's a lot to be said for smallholder farming. This may very well become a luxury of the temperate world if temperatures become too high for people to be outdoors during the day in the tropical world. I'm afraid, you know, that, you know, with 2 degrees of heating, we're going to see that across large swathes of Africa, Latin America, and Asia, with potentially horrendous implications. But, you know, we can't rely on it. It's not enough, because, you know, even if you do it beautifully, if you get temperatures above a certain point, your crops are going to die. You know, I've been growing food now for 25 years. I've got an orchard on an allotment here in Oxford, and you know, we do it all beautifully. I mean, we do everything right. You know, we really, really worked at it. You know, I do it with 4 other families, and we know a lot about orcharding now. We know a great deal about how to grow fruit trees well, and the trees grow beautifully. And yet again, everything just got wiped out by a late frost. You know, but the opposite problem is going to prevail in the future, where things are going to get wiped out by drought. They're going to get wiped out by heat, and there's nothing you can do about it. Yeah, that's what you keep bumping up against. There's just nothing you can do about it. So it doesn't matter whether you're big, whether you're small, what the techniques you're using. If the climate is wrong, it wipes you out.
Sorry, I'm muting myself. I don't know all the bird song around here to distract people. A couple of big questions. But before we go to those big questions, just let one or two people have kind of want personal advice, you know. So what, listening to you, what can I do in the way, you know, I eat and or drink or just sport myself? And secondly, intriguing question from somebody, anonymous, but what would you do if you could live your life again? What would you do different at Oxford? You've got a lot of Oxford undergraduates listening to you at the moment, watching you. What's your advice to them?
Thank you. Okay. On the first, I mean, if we're talking about our role as consumers, actually changing diet is one of the few really powerful things you can do. Changing your transport habits, so flying much less or not at all, going by bicycle or public transport rather than by car. Those are two big things you can do. But changing your diet also is a massive change you can make. I mean, and I say this as someone who believes that most change has to be brokered in our role as citizens, demanding structural political change. But as consumers, yeah, changing your diet's a big deal. Switching away from an animal-based diet to a plant-based diet is the biggest environmental intervention you can make by a long way. Much, much bigger than the question of where your food comes from. In fact, food miles have been massively overemphasized in terms of their environmental impact, whereas the kind of food you eat has been massively underemphasized. You will have far less impact eating tofu produced from soya in North America than sausages from the farm just down the road, not least because those pigs are probably being fed on soya anyway, plus a whole lot of other stuff, far less efficiently than you would process that soya if you eat it yourself. And there's a very interesting study published by Our World in Data, looking at the different environmental components of your diet. Food miles is tiny by comparison to food type, really, really tiny. And we've all got totally hooked up on localism, whereas actually we should be far more concerned about what it is that we're eating, regardless of where it comes from. Obviously, don't buy stuff that's been flown in, but otherwise, the transport miles really are a very minor component of it.
Huh.
What would I do again if I was an undergraduate? I wouldn't have gone to Oxford.
If you're an undergraduate again.
Again, yeah. I'm afraid I wouldn't have gone to Oxford. Sorry about that. I mean, it was a great degree. I had amazing people like Richard Dawkins and John Krebs and Bill Hamilton teaching me. There was a lot that was good about it, but it's just too much of a pressure cooker. You know, I just felt there was so much competitive drive, and it was a real attention economy where you sort of felt the need constantly to draw attention to yourself. It was very bad for my mental health. I mean, I had a nervous breakdown halfway through as an undergraduate, and I don't think that would have happened at a university where there was less of that social pressure. I became something I wasn't. I got drunk far too often. I made an idiot of myself, and I think it was all just a bit. The expectations were too high. There's too much competitive pressure. It didn't work for me at all. And I'm not saying that to put anyone else off or to say you made the wrong choice or anything like that. I don't want to create that impression at all. It didn't work for me. And I wouldn't go to Oxford again. I would go to a less prestigious university, also one which had much greater emphasis on environmental issues. I did zoology at Oxford, and we begged our lecturers to talk about environmental issues because we otherwise wouldn't have had a single lecture about it. And unfortunately, they just weren't equipped to do so. And the one environmental lecture we had was a farce. And even then, and this was when dinosaurs roamed the earth, it just seemed completely ridiculous that here we were studying the natural world, but not studying what was happening to it.
Yeah. Two big questions. One about, you have not talked, thank you for that, and I'm sure that will evince some questions. I mean, there is some movement on, there's some movement, I wouldn't overstate it, but there's some movement about taking the environment more seriously. I mean, one of the reasons,
there is.
one of the reasons why you're, is that, Hertford undergraduates were very keen to have you, as were some of our as one of some of our fellows actually. So you are being heard and there is movement. But look, you've not talked much about the ocean and the scope for the ocean to solve part of this crisis. And others are concerned about the kind of world you're describing, how that kind of meshes with the rewilding agenda.
Yeah, thank you. No, good questions again. So the oceans at the moment are massively overexploited. We see all these Blue Planet programs and things saying the problem is plastic. Yeah, plastic's horrible. Plastic is a big problem. It's not nearly as big a problem as commercial fishing. Commercial fishing is by far and away the biggest pressure on the marine environment, and it's causing cascading ecological collapse in most parts of the sea now. It's absolutely devastating. And fish farming isn't any better, because what are the fish fed on? Fish, which is harvested from the wild, generally nowadays by super trawlers, which mop up not just entire shoals of bait fish, but the dolphins and all the other creatures which are chasing those bait fish. And we see absolute devastation wreaked among dolphin populations all around Britain and Europe at the moment. They're just being wiped out. They're being driven towards extinction by super trawlers. And what we need to see is vast areas of sea closed to commercial fishing. At the moment, we have a whole load of marine protected areas in the UK. They're called marine protected areas, but they are just lines on the map. They're completely unprotected. You're still allowed to trawl through them. You're allowed to dredge through them. We have 51,000 square kilometres of territorial waters in the UK. 5 out of 51,000 of those square kilometres is all fishing banned. It's insane. It's totally ridiculous. It's just a complete free-for-all. Our seas are being torn apart by fishing. So stop eating fish, please. Rewilding, yeah. I mean, straight away you can start to see marine rewilding as very large tracts of sea are left alone. If we had proper protected areas, they would rewild by themselves. The vast shoals of herring and mackerel would return, the bluefin tuna, which used to storm round our coasts, the dolphins, the sperm whales, the fin whales, the humpbacks, all the rest which we used to have in vast abundance around Britain, they would return. The seabed would rebuild. You get oysters the size of dinner plates once more. You get giant crabs and lobsters. You get cod 6 foot long. All these amazing creatures would come back by themselves. On land, often it requires more help. But again, and this, perhaps I should have said it in my initial talk, is, another thing we've got to do is to draw down as much carbon as possible to try to avert disaster. It's not enough now just to leave fossil fuels in the ground. If we're not to face total climate breakdown, we also have to draw down carbon from the air, and that means natural climate solutions, which basically means rewilding. And rewilding is a great idea, both for ecological restoration and trying to stop the 6th great extinction, but also for drawing down the carbon dioxide we've already produced. And to have any hope really of getting through this century, we've got to not just maximize mitigation, which means leaving fossil fuels in the ground, but also maximize carbon drawdown from the air. And the most effective way of doing that is allowing the trees to come back, allowing the seabed to reform, allowing peat bogs to reform, allow mangroves and salt marshes to grow. They all draw down carbon quickly. Trees, some places more quickly than others, but broadly speaking, ecological restoration is also climate restoration. And if we can release as much land as possible, which is my overriding ecological aim as far as farming is concerned, from agriculture, then we can start to rewild some of that land. And we use land in a phenomenally profligate way at the moment. If you look, for instance, at the uplands of Britain, roughly 4 million hectares of those uplands, twice the size of our entire built environment, almost the same size as all the arable land we've got in this country. Roughly 4 million hectares are used for sheep production, and yet sheep produce just 1% of our diet. It's a ridiculous waste of land. That land would be far better used as wildlife refuges, drawing down carbon, preventing floods, allowing ecosystems to return. So let's do all that. We'd hardly lose any food production at all. concentrate food production in a few places, well, in the places where it's productive, where it makes sense to grow food, do that as efficiently as possible while preserving the soil and preserving the other essential features, but at the same time work very hard now to start getting protein production out of agriculture, into the factory really, and get out of livestock.
We'll get into the last few questions, but just one question from me. I mean, I've got to know a water company called Severn Trent quite well, and I was at a presentation they did about 3 months ago, and you think you might have found it encouraging. I mean, they were describing how kind of working with nature was allowing them to actually manage the water system in the Upper Severn and in Wales in particular much better. I was really taken aback. You know, there was this hard-driving CEO kind of talking with amazing enthusiasm about, you know, essentially a Monbiot agenda. Have you come across all that?
Yes, I've been talking to people at United Utilities, having a very similar conversation. In this case, the work they're doing in the Lake District, and you know, they've worked out that natural flood management and having stable soil and trees in the catchment and the rest of it. I mean, one, you get a far more stable hydrological cycle rather than this cycle of floods and droughts. You get a far steadier flow of water, but also you get much cleaner water. And I'd like to see buffer zones around all our rivers which aren't cultivated, where you don't plough right up to the margin, you don't allow livestock right up to the river. You have a buffer zone where you allow natural vegetation to filter out pollutants, to stop silt from getting into the river, keep the soil on the land, very useful, and also become wildlife corridors, allowing wildlife to move up and down. You know, we're
working. I mean, Severn Trent are even working with farmers to try and persuade them to, you know, not use pesticides because it accentuates the runoff and makes the water filthier. And actually encourage them to have, you know, wild plants at the verge of fields, so that actually that becomes the way you control kind of insects that eat their crops. I mean, I was actually, I thought George Monbiot, if he was here, would like this. I don't know, would you?
Yeah, but you know what happens is that when farmers do that and take rewild small parts of their land for that reason, though that land becomes ineligible for subsidies, because under the Common Agricultural Policy, your land has to be in agricultural condition to qualify for subsidies. You don't have to grow anything, produce anything at all. It just has to look as if farming takes place there. Otherwise, it gets excluded from the agricultural envelope and you lose your money. So the Common Agricultural Policy is a massive perverse incentive for cultivating even land where it makes no sense at all to be farming and destroying wildlife habitat. And across Europe, it's destroyed hundreds of thousands of hectares of prime wildlife habitat. I mean, I've seen it happening in Romania, I've seen it happening in Wales, I've seen it happening in France. It's a total disaster. And, you know, while like you, I'm a Remainer, getting out of that is a very good side of Brexit.
A couple of questions and then we'll finish off. I mean, I'll give you a rousing question to finish off, but a couple of folk have asked about insects and whether that kind of insects and lizard life is but insects in particular, a source of protein. Yeah,
well, I've eaten dozens of different species of insects. My favorite British insect is earwigs, actually. They're extremely tasty.
Amazing, George. You are amazing.
I've tried all sorts. I don't get an earwig infestation in the orchard. I just go around picking them off and eating them. But it's always going to be marginal, you know. And so there's, by comparison to microbial protein, there's two problems. One is that you need to feed the insects on plant material. You can use food waste, but actually what always happens is they say they're going to do it with food waste and then they use fresh materials because you want consistent feedstocks and it's much cheaper. It fits the whole capitalist model much better to use fresh feedstocks than to use waste material. So you need to feed them on plants, so you're still locked into agriculture. But also, I think there is actually going to be much higher resistance to eating insect protein than eating microbial protein. I know that might sound counterintuitive, but microbial protein is just flour, really. It's just really consistent, ordinary looking flour, which can then plug straight into, especially if you genetically engineer it to produce the right lipids, the right proteins, can be plugged straight into cultured meat and all the rest of it. Whereas insect protein, you're basically eating insects. You know, you're not going to use it either commercially or very usefully to be producing other products. So you have to tell people, right, you know, enjoy your meal of grasshoppers. And for people like me, that's great. I love grasshoppers. You know, they're delicious, but most people are not going to enjoy their meal of grasshoppers.
I love the vision of you as a kind of grasshopper, kind of earwig eater. A couple of questions we better round off because we're getting to our 6:45 drop dead moment. If we can't get people to believe in the science of vaccines, how can we ensure appreciation of science and food technology when it's so visible every day?
Well, the first thing to say is that most people do accept vaccines, and there's a lot of very noisy people on the internet who, and sometimes out on stupid protests, shouting about vaccines, but they, unless you're in Totnes, they really do not represent the majority. They're a very small minority. They might be noisy, they might be a pain in the butt, but you know, there's very few of them. And actually, you know, on the whole, I'm quite cheered by people's acceptance of scientific realities. We've seen far more acceptance of the reality of climate breakdown over the last few years than there was just 10 years ago. Science sort of gets purchase. It's not, you know, that's not one of the things that I'm most concerned about. Obviously, there will be issues to discuss and explain with people. But, you know, the conspiracy theories, the anti-vaxxers, people, I think they're best ignored. I mean,
are you worried that if you, you're so far away from this, it almost seems far-fetched, but are you worried that if you did pull this off and you did persuade governments and corporations to get behind what that actually would encourage, you know, technological fixes in other areas where, I mean, energy, etc., where actually you might want to take a different stance, or is your technological fix kind of common to many environmental challenges?
Well, look, I'm not a big fan on the whole of technological fixes, but you know, I can't see anywhere else to go with this. It's just really, really hard. I mean, anything we do in food production is a technological fix. You know, even if you're going back to smallholder cultivation with a mattock, that's a technological fix. It's just a different technological fix. You know, we apply technology to the land to produce food. That's, you know, even when your technology consisted of no more than an ox plow, you were applying technology. So it's going to be a technological fix or a series of technological fixes meshed in with political and economic change, which is going to get us through this, if anything gets us through it. And obviously, every issue we face is going to have to require all of that stuff. It's going to have to require politics, it's going to have to require economics, and it's going to have to require technology. The pandemic is a very good example of that. You know, we need, you know, if we had had effective politics in this country, we could be in the situation now of South Korea or New Zealand. But what South Korea and New Zealand had was effective, brave, firm politicians who said, this is what we're going to do, but also using technology as effectively as possible, whether that's PPE, whether that, you know, we're hopefully developing a vaccine, one should hope, but, you know, there's a whole lot of physical distancing technologies, the apps and tracking technologies, testing technologies. It's that combination. We use the technology in combination with clear democratic political direction. And so basically the task is to peel both technology and politics away from corporate capture. You know, politics in this, I mean, the reason why things go so badly wrong in this country is exposed by the coronavirus, is that politics has pretty well been captured by money. I mean, it is dominated by an oligarchy, whether that's Rupert Murdoch, whether that's a hedge fund managers who are pouring money into the Conservative Party. You know, the money has taken over. It looks more like a plutocracy than a democracy. And that's why it's gone so horribly wrong, because the government is ineffective by design. It's not supposed to intervene effectively. It's supposed to let the market rip, remembering the market means the power of money. And it's not supposed to interfere in that. So when something goes horribly wrong, it's in completely the wrong place, the wrong mindset, to do something about it. So we need to peel politics away from money, peel it away from corporate lobbyists. We need to do the same with technology. It's so important, I believe, that everything possible should be developed as open source rather than as corporate IP.
Just very, in a sentence or two, no more than that, because we're now really at the end. How optimistic are you? How hopeful are you?
Well, I've always been pessimistic about what we do and optimistic about what we are. I think we're much better creatures than we give ourselves credit for. I mean, it's a complete myth that our dominant values are selfishness and greed.
You read this new book on humanity that's just come out then? Have you come across that?
You mean Humankind?
Yeah, Humankind. Don't tell me you've got it.
Yeah.
Anna reads Earwigs and reads Humankind. You know, checkmate. You've got me. Okay.
I mean, I've got every book in the world in this office right here. So. Or so it seems.
I like
having it is not the same as reading it. Anyway, but yeah, no, I mean, he's right. You know, and it's something I've been saying for a long time, is that we've been completely misled about what human nature is. You know, that our dominant values are not selfishness and greed. They are community. They are belonging. They are family. They are doing good, altruism, benevolence. You know, those are our dominant values. We're in the peculiar position that we're basically a society of altruists governed by psychopaths, because the people in power tend not to share those dominant human values. How do we get in this state? I mean, it's ridiculous. You know, that's the thing we need to be fighting. Let's stop electing psychopaths to represent us. They do not represent us. They're not representative of humankind. You know, let's have much better government. And I believe we can do that. And I believe we can have far more deliberative politics, participatory politics than we have at the moment, where we mix our representative system with participation. So we have much more of a people's voice, and people know they're being heard. And then when people know they're being heard, they're not being treated like idiots. They tend to respond like intelligent people, and you don't get the political idiocy that we're seeing becoming dominant in the world. And when you look at programs like Better Reykjavik or Decide Madrid or participatory budgeting in Porto Alegre, people become really intelligent political participants. We can change things. It's just a matter of political will. Isn't that what the virus has shown us? All these things we were told were impossible. Oh, austerity, that's baked in. You can't do anything about that. Governments can't borrow anymore. The homeless, it's terribly sad, isn't it? But they'll always be with us. We can't find homes. Oh, as soon as they become a public health hazard, oh, instantly the government says they've all got to be housed. So you could do that after all. It wasn't a physical impossibility. It wasn't an economic impossibility. It was a matter of political will. That's a big lesson we should learn from the pandemic. It's just about political will. If we want to change it, we can.
George, that's a great note to end on. I want to give you a round of applause, but of course we can't do that here. But I know from the volume of questions, which has been really, I mean, just huge. I get almost everyone who was on the call has tried to ask you a question. I hope I've tried to capture the sense of most of them. That was wonderful, and I mean, all power to your elbow. I think that we need a few more Monbiots. I'm kind of, Garibaldi, conquered Italy in 1,000 red shirts. We need 1,000 Monbiots. We could maybe change the world. We need a few more of you.
A hideous prospect.
Really,
I'll stop reading. Sorry.
No, but a lot of people are. A lot of people are not only persuaded by you, but are kind of inspired by the fact that you walk the talk. Whether you're eating grasshoppers, tending your perfect orchard, or living on tofu, you are really you try to you walk the talk, and in your books and your writing, you inspire hundreds of thousands of people. So good on you, and carry it on. Do carry it on.
Well, thank you so much, Will, and thanks everyone for listening. Great to talk to you. Just sorry not to be able to meet you all.
Okay. Well, I'm now going to end the meeting, but thank you so much again. And I'm sorry, if it was I'd now walk you across away from the bearing room. You'd see the Hertford Bridge size on your left. We'd take you for a drink, and we'd give you tofu and well, we're probably upstaying on insects, but we'd give you a meal that you'd appreciate. But we can't do it. I'm sorry. Anyway, but the intent is there. Thank you so much for doing it in this crazy weirdest, in which someone called it the great weirdness. It is the great weirdness. But thank you for doing it. Okay, ciao.
Cheers, Will. Bye.
Bye. Bye.